Welcome to Gradient Proof, a long-form discussion on a range of topics from AI to philosophy to entrepreneurship. We start each podcast sober and let the proof gradient the course of discussion. As always, we encourage you to drink with us. Welcome to the Gradient. I guess let's start off. Stephen and I will typically get together, have drinks, and just go deep into conversation about different aspects of life, technology. We both have a technology background, business background, finance. We've both been to, different places around the world, like Asia. Stephen lived in China for about 7 years. Speaks fluent Chinese, right?
Yep.
And as life kind of moves by, there's this question of how do we, what's the meaning of it, right? Because things are moving very quickly. Your lifespan, what you contribute to the world is essentially, unless you're a significant, person like Christopher Columbus, Elon Musk, something like that. How do you, is the point to leave a legacy? Is the point of life to, I guess, what's the point? So, and I think we can get into, what lifespans will ultimately be. Right
Sure.
now, I think a lot of people think of, okay, you live until 70 or 80,
Yep.
whatever the average is. But I think there's an opportunity here to leave a little bit behind for maybe future generations, because if you think of your own family, the past 200 years, who do you know within your own family from 200
Sure.
years ago? Have you ever heard their voice? Probably not.
Yep.
So, what does the future look like when someone can pull up your Facebook and see what you were thinking as like a 13-year-old or 14-year-old, whenever, you got on the platform?
Sure.
And what, Stephen or Roy were thinking at that age. I know it would probably be pretty embarrassing, but I think, there's also an opportunity there to see how a life develops versus, thinking of, like, for instance, my great grandparents or whoever it might be. You may have one or two photos, of them polished up and looking their best, right? But
So are you suggesting we'll take these podcasts and kind of diamond and code them and leave them on the moon or something like that for future generations?
well, I think right now it's more, at least for me, and I think maybe for you, it's more of a personal
Sure.
kind of exploration.
Yep.
I think there's something noble about stepping out of your comfort zone. I mean, obviously, I'm a little bit nervous, but I think that's half the fun of getting into this. But maybe our podcast will not be the most famous or whatever it is, but I think
Sure.
for our family, it could be an interesting way to say, what was Stephen thinking in 2021 after the COVID crisis, or wherever this goes, if we're doing this for years, right?
Right.
But I think if you think about like Joe Rogan, for instance, I think in hundreds of years from now, people are still going to be listening to his podcast and thinking, what were people thinking during that time, right?
Wow.
And it's not one perspective. It's
Sure.
thinking about what does astrologers, biologists,
Sure.
comedians, right? It's kind of all different spectrums of life.
Right.
And it becomes this kind of encapsulation. And the beautiful thing about it is I don't think the people sitting there, even Rogan himself, are sitting and saying, this is the purpose of this, right? That this is going to be some kind of reference for future generations.
Sure.
Like, imagine if you had a Joe Rogan podcast for like the 1800s,
Sure.
where people,
But let's play with that. If you had a Joe Rogan podcast for the 1800s, would you be listening to it? Right? Because your earlier statement about 100 years from now listening to Joe Rogan,
Right.
I would wonder if Joe Rogan has the type of cultural relevance at
Right.
that period
Right.
as much as somebody in the 1800s might not perhaps wrongly speak to you in the way you think they might.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's maybe for more specific reasons, right? Like if you're a comedian and you're interested in comedy and you're researching historical, because, you're going to, obviously this is like, if you're looking at 1800s Joe Rogan, it's more of a specific search for information, right? And
Right.
I guess we do that naturally, right? When we're like interested in it. It's not like, some people, I guess, will go home and watch a movie from the 1950s or whatever, right? But at least it's there and it appeals to like multiple different levels
Sure.
of information on different levels of, different categories, right? So, worst case scenario, our great-great-grandkids can look at this and be like,
Sure.
wow, these guys are a bunch of idiots, or say, hey, that's pretty cool that, but then also like on a technological standpoint, there's companies now that they'll read a little bit of information or an audio file and then be able to then create essentially like a voice actor with with just a little bit of text.
So the goal of this is for us to be perfect voice actors. Yes.
Pretty
Virtual
much, yeah.
voice actors.
Well,
all right.
I think that could lead you down the road of like, okay, let's say you are able to trick somebody that the person sitting across from you is not actually real. And you did that at scale. I mean, why would something like a simulation not be totally possible, right?
Right.
Like we've talked about this before, which is how many nodes of information do you need to believe something is true? Like,
right.
Do 2 articles from CNN and, one from a friend make something a truism to you? Like,
right.
Like, how many times have we been to the North Pole and seen, change there? Or how do you even know someone you're calling across the country is there, except for the visual, the voice coming over the phone or video?
And I like to think about it back to what you were talking about, Joe Rogan in the 1800s. It seems that as time is elongated, you can make the argument that you need less nodes of information, right? Meaning that if you find a letter in a drawer from 75 or 80 years ago, right, that letter is more likely to be taken as truth, right, than if in fact you find a letter today, right, which you would, it could be written by anyone, or there would be a sense of verifiability that this in fact was written by the author it purports to have been written.
Right, exactly. So, like, if, let's say you were, like from a computational standpoint, if you wanted to create like a simulated universe and you were to say what would be the most computationally effective time to place the player into this virtual world, I mean, you might say it's right now, right? Because if you, to go back and dig in the data, like you said, you just need one letter or one photograph or, one piece of evidence to tell a larger story. Whereas today, I think it's, there's so much data, there's so much information.
Right.
How do you, that's being created at all times. Like if you started a simulation in year 3021, I mean, think about how much data we're going to create then versus, what we're doing right now.
But perhaps a little less optimistically, I wonder, have you heard of this premise of the digital dark ages? That the premise is right now we're living in the digital dark ages in the sense that future historians will look back in this era and they will say to themselves that we know there was so much information there, right? But the survivability of that information is quite limited, right? So for example, when you think of the typical person, 25 years ago, you probably were sending or receiving emails, but the retrievability of that email today is quite a bit more limited than maybe that letter you sent home from summer camp, which is, either in your mother's drawer or maybe even your chest in a storage locker somewhere, right? And the survivability of that letter from summer camp, right, is going to survive more than probably a decade worth of emails that you sent and received while you were in your 20s, right? And that's kind of the premise around this idea of the digital dark ages, which brings me back to the idea, should we diamond encode these things? Meaning put it on a substrata that's going to survive 20,000 years, put it on the moon, and then it'll be good to go.
And it's done.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, to your point, I wonder if the reason that it's a dark age and that some of that information will be lost, like an email from, let's say, an AOL server versus a Gmail one, right? So I guess obviously it's very turbulent, right? Because when a new technology comes along, right, like the internet, you're going to have different people who are fighting for market share, and people are going to move from different providers to others, and companies go out of business, into business, whatever it is. But that letter that's tucked away in that cabinet or framed on the wall, unless you have a fire or something, you're probably going to keep that for as long as possible until like one of your descendants is like, oh, what the hell is this, and throw it out, right?
So the same could be said for, say, a newspaper from 1950 versus a digital e-zine from 2005. Right. The newspaper from 50 just keeps sticking around, to the point where it becomes a collector's item. Versus the '05 piece was never really appreciated, never really cared for, and over time it's a broken link somewhere on the internet and it's gone. Right.
I mean, the beauty of it, and then the curse and the blessing or whatever, is that information, right, is is not physically tangible, right? So like Kevin Kelly, like he started I think the Good Earth Journal, but he wrote this book called Inevitable, and he talks about how once things become more cheap, like MP3 files, you see this return to like a more tangible method, right? So like when you walk into Urban Outfitters, or at least when you used to, you would see like record players, and now they're like this hip, cool thing to like play a record and grab that physical artifact. Whereas on a computer or a hard drive that you have collecting dust somewhere, you've got more songs that you could fill a room with records. Sure. Right? So, and I mean, so losing that information over time, I wonder if that's is the information that's necessary, like that letter, right, has some importance, so it's placed with some importance, right? In the realm of like reality, right? But then a digital piece, how is that held like in importance?
Well, I think also along the way is and probably yourself as well. I have a couple of former hard drives. I think maybe even 2 or 3, right? Sitting in my storage unit, right? And what's the problem there? It isn't that I'm not holding them in importance, right? There are pictures on them. There's authorship on them. There's emails on them, right? But they don't spin up anymore, right? And it's not rocket science to bring them to some sort of IT place and have them spin the platters and put it on USB for you. The only issue is it's a time commitment, right? And last I looked, I mean, particularly here in New York, that's maybe $500, $700 per spin up, right? And if you have 3 hard drives, right, that's it's an investment, and then you keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and somebody else later finds this stuff and they don't know what's on it, right? And all they know is it doesn't work, right? And I wonder, as opposed to the letter, it's kind of like, well, that seems to be cool. Right.
It's like an Egyptian artifact, right? So, I mean, what's interesting is the more technology advances, it seems like we get less physical, right? So, like, pretend in, let's say, 1,000,000 years from now, right? You no longer need like factories or museums or buildings or anything like that, because everything exists within a chip in your brain there's a central node somewhere where all the world's information is AI processed and just beams whatever information you want. And there's something like a 3D molecular printer in your stomach that feeds you food, and you only eat for fun, right? Like Romans used to, and then throw up in, whatever the fountains were. And, so it becomes way less physical, right? But the issue, well, maybe, I don't know if it's an issue, but one thing that happens is if some catastrophic thing were to happen and those people no longer existed, then there would be no reminiscent. Like it's like if you go to the pyramids, I haven't been, but obviously seen photos and stuff, but they're built out of stone for potentially a reason, because the intent was that it were to survive, right? If you leave like the Golden Gate Bridge unattended and unmaintained for a few hundred years, it's not going to look anywhere near where it might not even stand, right? So is that like a negative side to technology? But I mean, I guess the question is like, if you're at that point and you've removed any physical interface that you need to interact with, I mean, I guess it doesn't matter what happens once you're gone, because if you're gone, you're gone. But what if you can live forever, right? And I don't know if you want to talk about that, but
or inversely, what if you can live for an extended period of time and you have quite the gramophone collection in your closet, right? And what you're missing, I mean, that's actually an interesting exercise. I haven't ever searched for a gramophone on Amazon anyway. I'd imagine it's not a hot seller. You might be able to find it on eBay, right? Something like that. But it wouldn't be retro in the same way an 8-track player or a record player certainly would give you a lot of options, buying options, etc. Right. So do you have that classic information in mediums, kind of like the Apollo landers, where you no longer have the apparatus to pull it off anymore, right? And the people that built it have now passed away. Right. And there's no longer a market incentive to, kind of get that data. Which might, by the way, happen to my hard drives at some point.
Right.
Well, I complain about $700 to spin up the platter now.
Right. This is the window to do it.
Exactly. 10 or 15 years from now, right? It may become a real cost undertaking, right? Because who does that?
Right.
Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, it's almost like that would die with the people that did it, right?
Yeah.
Or there's just not a big enough market. It doesn't support it as a business. And also, I mean, the price is exorbitant because those people know what business they're in, right? I mean, they're tending to lost memories, right?
Right.
And they're the only way to bring it back, right? So, I mean, what could be interesting is if you had somebody who was like had a YouTube channel, showed you how to do it, and then you could just buy cheaper parts. But then, even then, I mean, you might get a lot of views on the YouTube channel, but how many people are going to be buying it to use that? Because you're going to use it once and convert it, and then probably not do it again.
Yeah.
Right.
Spinning up dry platters, it's still kind of semi-clean room-ish. You can't really do it on your desk, but no, understood. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, I mean, I don't know. Where do you see kind of what we're doing here? Like when you think of this podcast, obviously this is the first one. There's a lot of things we don't know.
It's the pilot. I want to emphasize that. It's a pilot.
Yeah, we're rusty. Straight out the gate.
So, no, I think this is a great undertaking, and thank you very much, Roy, for coming up with this idea.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, and I very much, like yourself, and enjoyed these type of conversations. There's, whether about AI philosophy, human longevity, technology, economics, market forces, right? All these things. I know we're both passionate about nuclear fusion and other things. We'll probably talk about that at some point. But no, I think this is a great opportunity, and the world loves podcasts, and we certainly love podcasts, right? When I'm not listening to podcasts, I'm usually listening to Clubhouse, right? The app, anyway, which is.
I mean, well, first off, let me say thank you as well. I mean, it's great to do it with you, and I think this is going to be a good way for us both to ping things off. I mean, obviously we see each other in social settings, so where the whole idea of this came together. So I think it'll be interesting from now on thinking about how to reserve some of these initial thoughts, because it's nice when you discuss something initially. Like if we talked about something we talked about previously, I think it would be not tainted, but we would know where the other person is thinking versus a more genuine.
Yeah, but I think it could also be shared again within the lighter reflection, right? Like so for Roy example, when we were talking about, and I was thinking, I'm not fatalistic about quote unquote lost ideas, right? Good ideas stick around, and there are layers to them, and as are good thought experiments, etc. Right? So
yeah, definitely. And I think I guess one thing we should say is the format right now is obviously Stephen and myself, but the hope is to also bring on people that are interested in having a conversation about different topics, and I don't think we're influenced to kind of discuss one thing or another. If anything, we like playing devil's advocate with each other, and just seeing how far you can take an issue. And I think that's kind of a response to this kind of one way of thinking, one feed type of content that's coming out from a lot of different people. And I mean, at least my background comes from a more debative kind of household. So I think that's where you're kind of tested to see, am I just blowing smoke up my own ass, or am I actually, legit, right? Or even if it's not legit, I mean, I don't think we're sitting here and saying we know everything. I think we're just saying this is what we know at this point in time. And we're interested in kind of just discussing it openly, because we do that naturally anyways.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So do you have a topic you want to discuss? There's one that I kind of want to jump into, but
sure, go for it, please. Yeah.
Well, okay. So we're talking about technology, where things are going, right? I guess how does right now, I guess, how long do you think you will live?
Right now, I would probably peg it somewhere between 120 and 140 years, right? I used to, I think growing up, if you would have asked me, I was always like, I'm going to live to 114, which is, still a little bit long, but not as long is the way I'd kind of place it right now. Right.
Why 14? 114?
I don't know. I think it was, I think I had read or misread, somewhere in the Old Testament about, and derived from that is some other reference to, the age in which kind of like your neural envelope kind of decays, right? Like, where your brain sits and there's that breakdown on the boundary, right? Okay.
Right.
And then at which point it's very hard to go beyond that, right? Now I am still quite a bit more optimistic, right? I think 2030 is proving to be kind of the longevity decade in terms of the next phase of what we would call biotech and big pharma, right? I think everything is going to be about longevity, from skin products to arthritis medicine to honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we're all taking some form of Alzheimer medication. Probably 10 years from now, and probably everybody, right? North of the age of 25, right? And that again is either performance enhancing or certainly keeping one at a level of, thought fluidity, right? In a way we don't do today. And I think you're going to see like things like that across the board, right? And
definitely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like, my grandfather died almost a decade ago, but one thing he said like before he died was like, "Oh, I'm not supposed to be 80 years old. Like that's not like in my story or whatever." And it, I've always kind of thought about that. Like, did he die when he died because of like what part of his mental framework was saying, "Hey, at this age, that's when I'm out," versus thinking, "Hey, I'm 80 years old. I feel like I'm 30. Let's fucking go," right? And so. I think we both think the same thing, which is, the last couple decades, the biggest technological change has been the internet. It's changed the way that humans interact with each other. To think that the iPhone came out in 2007 and what we're dealing with now is like unbelievable. But I think the next wave is going to be, like you said, a way to kind of treat aging and understand how our bodies age and things like that.
And more significantly, I think you say that rightly, treat aging, right? If you roll the clock back, as a friend of mine used to always emphasize, it's just kind of aging what was not allowed to be considered a disease, right? And if you treat it as a disease, i.e. The misassigning of or misscripting of an Alzheimer's medication, to a non-Alzheimer's based individual for obvious cognitive enhancement, again, at an earlier age, This, in fact, was not only permissible, it was actually an illegal activity, quite frankly, And I think we've been moving further and further in a direction where, first of all, longevity is thought of, or aging is thought of within the medical strictures of what are commonly thought of as a disease, And you can start to run clinical trials treating the symptoms of aging, as a function of aging being a disease. And furthermore, you can do these other type of activities with increasing liberalness, assigning type of medicines and treatments that quite frankly, would have been inaccessible within the standard medical community to somebody in their 30s or 40s or early 50s.
Right. No, yeah, absolutely. And, talking about classifying it as a disease, I think, so right now there's a few different supplements that you can buy over the counter that there are studies that have shown that, have reduced aging in mice and things like that, but have not been proven like in clinical trials with humans, right? So the question is like, once if the FDA or whatever governing body of whatever government it is says this is now a disease that we'd like to cure and treat and whatever, then what happens to those types of supplements? Like, do they become this kind of something that you then have to get a prescription for versus something that you could potentially buy over the counter, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually see increasing liberalization across the board, right? And one of the reasons I think is when you look at what is one of the larger voting blocks that has a specific interest in these age-related issues, right? It's going to be the baby boomers that are equally well healed in terms of being able to make you know, certain contributions of political candidates and et cetera.
Right.
And I honestly, I see the world going in a direction of like Prevagen, right? It's going to be, over the counter. It's going to be advertised on TV. It's just almost going to be commonplace, right? But it isn't going to be Prevagen. It's going to be the second or third generation iteration of, right? And I think the aging baby boomers are going to have a lot to do with that, because they're going to vote with their checkbook in the ballot box, and regulations are going to be adjusted accordingly.
Right. No, absolutely. And obviously with them aging as well, you know, trying to find a way to remedy that and change that. I think we spoke about this before, but David Sinclair is a Harvard biologist. He wrote a book called Lifespan, and he was talking about in the future. I mean, I forgot if he specified a timeline, but essentially what you would do is you'd take a certain pill that would release like kind of genetic instructions to your genes to reset, let's say, to an age when you were 25. Let's say. But it would only be triggered by a certain molecule that you would never encounter, like in typical consumption and stuff like that. So every time you would hit 35, let's say, you would take a dose of this pill, your body would revert back to 25. So, you know, because, you know, the dangers of, let's say, cancer and stuff like that, I mean, those don't just start once you're at, you know, in your 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever. It's you know, your body's better at handling those types of issues when they're younger, right? So if there's like an optimum age that you could then keep your body at, I don't know enough about the science of it, but I think it's interesting to talk about kind of like the psychological, like what happens, right? Like let's say there is like a husband and wife, and one likes being 45 and the other one likes being like 22, right? And it looks like a father and son, but they're like 400, 500 years old, and they're running around a city together, right? Or, you know, when you think, hey, I'm supposed to be dead at 80, and then before you know it, you're 500 years old. I mean, how do you plan your life, right? Like people go to, you know, you go to school, you graduate, you go to school for 4 or 5 years, whatever, and then you do something for 40 years, retire, and hang out with your grandkids, right? That's like probably the dream of most people, right? Or the reality of most people. What happens when you say, hey, you're 80, now you're going to have your 25-year-old body, and you're going to live for 10,000 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, you jumped to 400, 500, and then 10,000. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, these are long periods of time, certainly. But to the other question, though, it's interesting when you mentioned 25, because it's a thought experiment. I always think about, like, what age would I like to go back to? And I usually actually come up with 27, right? I think it's a happy medium of, you know, not being too young, but still having all the strength and vitality, right, of yet your 20s, right, and doing it all over again. It'd be kind of interesting from a career perspective, right, where it'd be interesting to think about where effectively you have the experience level of a 50-year-old professionally, right? But you're 27, and how that manifests itself or doesn't, right? You know, the world could actually tip on its head, and the cultural relevancy is actually with the 20-year-olds, right? And you being the 50-year-old may want to, you know, hide the fact that you were once 50, as opposed to being promoted for it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess. Yeah, there's something interesting about that, right? Because if you are a 50-year-old in a 27-year-old body, and you know, okay, let's say you go to a bar and everyone's 27, and there's a 50-year-old that walks in, it's, you know, and uses some kind of slang of the time. Is it seen because of their physical appearance as something that's a, you know, like off? There's something weird. It just feels off, right? But if you were 27, but you acted like a 50-year-old,
right?
Would there also be something off, or like what holds more precedent? Is it the lingo itself, or is it the visual appearance? And I don't mean lingo necessarily, but I just mean like, you know, how the person presents themselves, right?
Sure. I mean, one can think of a variety of scenarios in which, I mean, the question of discourse in these situations and how it plays out, and how in fact it could be different. Wherein, I wonder I wonder who puts more importance on the social interactions
Right.
of being in bars,
Right.
the 50-year-olds in a younger body, or the actual aged person, right, that's
Right.
experiencing this for the first time,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
Are they equally ambivalent, or is one more so than the other, and whom, right? I don't know, right? It's kind of interesting, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, because I think now
Yeah.
if you were to walk, like
Sure.
what's true now is,
Right.
is maybe what you look like physically, right? I mean, some people maybe look older or younger, whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you walk up to an 80-year-old man or whatever, you're gonna make potentially some assumptions, right? Like they might have more wisdom than you because they've been around the sun
Mm-hmm.
more times, which may or may not be true. But you never see like a toddler playing like who's that guy in Harry Potter? Anyways, like a whatever, like a super.
Yeah.
Usually, wisdom is at least in film, right? Is tied
Yeah,
to
earned
some-
over years.
Yeah.
Oh, Dumbledore.
Dumbledore.
Yeah, Dumbledore.
Like,
You never see a toddler playing Dumbledore.
Like
no,
no-
agreed.
yeah, like no one's expecting that,
Sure,
right?
sure,
So let's say you live in a world where the way you look physically is
Mm-hmm.
totally a personal choice,
Sure.
right? I mean, that would be like there would have to be a rewiring right there.
Mm-hmm.
And like normally, like the people that were
Right.
in their 20s and the 50s and the 1800s, they had their way of thinking, right?
Sure.
If you place them in today's society and vice versa, the clashes
Sure.
would be pretty big. So like Steve Jobs said, like something along the lines of like the turnover
Sure,
is helps advance the world, right?
And to
People
that,
dying.
and to that point as well, you're right in the sense that if one could be an older age and go back to an earlier age of one's choosing physically, right?
Yeah.
It would be very interesting in the fact where would you see a break, say, of the 90-year-old, right? Who, some wanting to be 22,
Right,
right?
right.
But others thinking, 55 is a more suitable form,
Right.
for both who I am as a person and interactivity, right, with a larger society, right? Meaning
right.
that this person obviously is older, right, and is approachable as such, right?
Right.
As opposed to the 22-year-old, to your point, you don't come to them necessarily experiencing a Dumbledore-esque, like,
Right.
a psyche, right? But the 55-year-old might truly have it and want to present something a little closer to that,
Right.
to you.
I wonder if that's like in the transition phase of like, let's say when this technology becomes available. But I mean, I guess it's hard to imagine what it would be like once that's commonplace, where it's like, okay, you hit a certain age and then you're able to choose your own age, whatever it is, and you just, okay, I want to be 55. Which,
Sure.
I mean, you probably won't have people doing that because there are health effects with it, but it could be that, hey, I want my skin to look like I'm 55,
Right.
but I want my internal body, right? I mean, if you
Maybe.
could somehow figure out how to modify that, right?
Right.
I think it's kind of interesting to think about. I mean,
Yeah.
it's going to be weird. But then, I mean, at that point too, what if you could say, I want to change, my hairstyle, like my eye color or whatever it is, right? That's all, like your genetics are essentially what's written, your code, right? So if you can modify that code and then become like a,
Well,
something
here's
totally different.
another question: is does society become more diversified, or does it appear a little more monotonous? Right.
Right,
Like, for example, where is there kind of a commonly agreed upon "quote unquote" best age? So if you look at it in a kind of standard distribution, right?
Yeah.
Most likely, most of society is hovering around age X, right?
Right.
And you have derivations off of that, but it's actually a little unusual, right? So the further you move off to the one side, right,
Yeah.
the less people are manifesting themselves at that age, right? They're always kind of coming back. And what is that age? Is it 22? Is it 25? Is it 30?
Right,
Is it
right.
45?
Yeah,
Right? Whatever that age is,
Right,
right?
right.
And this is kind of the socially, kind of agreed upon. So when you walk down the sidewalk, everybody is kind of more or less looking the same.
Right. Yeah. Almost maybe exactly. Like, let's say they say like,
sure.
okay, Kim Kardashian is going to be what women look like, and I don't know, whatever. One guy's like, so everyone looks the same. So even the playing field, like let's say in the name of equality, right? So everyone looks the same. So you just have to go based off of who they are, on a personal level, right?
Sure.
Or whatever that might be. But it made me think of like, and who knows what nations will look like in 1,000 years, right? But how will different countries use that, because right now there's a response to
Sure.
the culture, right? There's a response to the environment, right? And people reflect that from
Yeah.
personality to everything, right?
Sure.
So, even on a neighborhood level, right? So it'll be interesting to see how, like, let's say we still have a structure where there's 150 plus nations, whatever it is.
Yeah.
How do each of those different people, deal with that new technology or use that technology? And then also on another hand, like, let's say you were a superpower and you developed this technology and you said, closing the borders, I'm not allowing anyone else except for whatever my nation is to live like so much longer, right? Because how much information do you gather in one lifetime? But if you have 1,000 of those,
Sure.
you don't have to restart every time and be in the right circumstances and blah, 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 and all that stuff. You could theoretically take over with that. Something
Maybe, but therein, I mean, your strength is also your weakness, right? Because you could argue that an older nation has everything to lose, right? While a younger nation has everything to gain, right? So meaning that if you truly have people behind your wall, right, that are getting on in their hundreds of years old, right? And you have another nation next door, right, that is by hook or by crook, they're going to improve upon their status, right? I wonder which one you actually bet on over time, right? And it almost kind of reminds me of when you go back to the Asimov novels, wherein you basically had humanity kind of fork apart in two ways. The one was largely, of course, those that were back on Earth, right? That had all those suspicions and skepticisms of robots in particular, right? And then you had these kind of off-world places in which equally the people lived a very, very long time, but they almost had a robotic plantation-like existence, right? And what was actually found was that from sheer technological innovation, right, and just a willingness to the people that lived for a very, very long time became increasingly risk adverse as cultures, right? Versus back on Earth, they were still living, I think in the context of these books, it was kind of Elijah and everybody were like 74 years, say, right? Which would have been standard around when those books were written, right? But they were moving forward much quicker, right? Without the robot caretakers, technology was innovating, and certainly in the later books, they kind of, moved ahead and pulled far ahead. So just a thought on that, right? And because it could equally be done at a nation level, but more likely being done at almost a planetary level, right? Perhaps.
But I mean, it's okay. So on the more plantation level type of thing. So was there like, are you saying that they were more complacent, or there was kind of more?
Well, it was a couple of different things. I mean, they had a culture unto themselves. One was that they had become so roboticized in terms of the servants, right? Okay, that they almost began to shun each other on a cultural level, right? Wherein interactions were again another source of risk, right? With interaction with another non-sanitized, there's the possibility for carriers and transmission of disease and bacteria and everything and such like that. So their immune systems themselves became a bit weakened, right? But added on to that, right, there was, let's put it this way, they weren't going out and recreationally skydiving, right? Because you had so much to lose. You could lose 200-300 years, right?
Right. Much more to lose.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, I mean, it kind of speaks to... Do you want me to fill you in first? Or?
1 second. Here.
Okay.
Sure.
It kind of speaks to if you look at like how a startup interacts versus, let's say, an established company, right?
Yeah.
Like, when Microsoft came up, right? It I mean, arguably couldn't have happened without IBM, right? Because they signed that infamous contract where they, allowed them to lease the operating system to third parties, right? But I guess the beauty of startups is you're able to maneuver much more quickly, right? You're when you make decisions, and say, okay, we're going to change, this or that or whatever it might be.
Right.
You only have to discuss it with a couple people versus like a bureaucracy where you have to go through like painstaking levels of like, okay, I need to convince my manager and how they think, and then they have to convince with the same.
Wait, there's more. To listen to the next part of this episode, please follow the platform catalog.